Hey everyone, it's Matt Miofsky. I am the pastor of the Gathering in St. Louis, but this isn't really a sermon. In fact, I don't know what to call this. I've been doing a few things during 2020. Of course, I preach every weekend. I'm a pastor of this church, the Gathering. I've been doing a little IG TV show on Instagram and on Facebook called Office Faith, where I've been interviewing interesting people about how their faith influences their life and their work. But this isn't exactly that. But I'm just going to post this in both places. It's sort of a bonus segment today, and it really has to do with the election, because of course we have an election coming up. A lot of people say it's going to be the most historic election of the modern age, and it just has a lot of people worked up and anxious. I know, maybe not because of who they're going to vote for. I think most people know who they're going to vote for, but I just get a lot of questions about, how we should be approaching this election. And oftentimes I will actually preach on faith and politics. I've done this a lot in the past at my church, but this year I just decided not to. It did not feel like a year where we needed more conversation about politics. And so I chose not to do it as a sermon series leading up to the election, but I didn't want people to be confused or to misunderstand that somehow I didn't think it was important or I don't think we should talk about it. In fact, I do. I think we should talk about how our faith impacts our politics. And I think that those are important conversations to have. So what I decided to do is I decided to cut this sort of bonus podcast. So you can check this out. It'll be on my Instagram TV. It'll be posted on social media. You might be listening or watching there. I'm also going to include it in our Gathering Sermon podcast, which I have every week. By the way, if you don't subscribe to the Gatherings podcast, which is my message every week, you ought to do that wherever you go. Find your podcasts, Apple Podcast. You can go there and search either my name or the Gathering Sermons. You'll find it. I would love for you to subscribe. It's a great way to stay in touch with the sermons, and this will be posted there as well. Okay. So I'm sitting in our sanctuary. I don't normally just do a podcast where I talk. I usually interview somebody, but today it's kind of me. And I have sitting on the other side of the camera, Jeff. Hi, Jeff. So I'm going to look at him every once in a while, and you'll know who I'm looking at. He is our tech guru, video producer here at the Gathering. So I was thinking about what questions I should reflect on a little bit for us, because like I said at the beginning, I suspect most of us know who we're going to vote for by now. The question isn't really kind of who should I vote for, but maybe there's a few questions floating through your mind. I mean, one question that I've been getting from people is just, should I even participate at all? I mean, I think there's a lot of people of faith who just wonder, it's a mess. I don't like any politicians. I think both sides are corrupt. The system's broken. Is this even something that we should be participating in? And I think this is a good question. I'm going to start there because I think as messy as the political system is, I'm a big believer that as Christians we ought to participate, that it's important to participate, that whoever we vote for, we ought to engage this process. And I know that it's messy. I mean, I get that. But I'm really reminded by something that Jesus told his followers. And I'm going to read it to you because I think it's important, not just for politics, but really for a lot of the ways that we engage the world around us. Jesus says this in John chapter 17, verse 14. He says, I gave your word to them, and the world hated them because they don't belong to this world. This is Jesus praying to God for his followers. So he says, I gave your word to them, the world hated them because they don't belong to this world, just as I don't belong to this world. I'm not asking that you take them out of this world, but that you keep them safe from the evil one. They don't belong to this world, just as I don't belong to this world. Make them holy in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. Now, maybe some of you have heard this little phrase that Christians are supposed to be in the world but not of the world. I don't know if you've ever heard that. This is the passage where that comes from. And the idea is that Christians are supposed to engage a messy, broken, often sinful world around us. But we should make sure that we don't become just like the world that we see around us. And I really do think that even though that exact phrasing isn't in the Bible, that is what Jesus kind of indicates here. Jesus is sort of saying, look, you're not defined by this world. The world is broken. The world is messy. But I need you to participate in it. I need you to engage it. I need you to be a part of it. If you remember, as Christians, we're supposed to be ambassadors. We're supposed to be truth tellers. We're supposed to be justice seekers. We're supposed to be light bearers. I mean, Jesus several times in the Gospels tells us that we are supposed to participate, oftentimes in messy situations, in difficult scenarios, in broken systems, specifically to bring hope, good news, light, truth, whatever it is that's needed in those situations. And I get that there has always been this instinct with Christians that when it gets too messy, that I just need to pull back and I don't want to get my hands dirty in something that's imperfect. But I really think that here Jesus kind of suggests that while it's really tempting to say, I do not want to become a part of this or complicit in this, to step back, I think Jesus says, look, I need you to walk that really fine line of participating and engaging while maintaining the identity that I've shaped in you. And therefore, Jesus says, kind of point blank, I know the world's messy, but I'm sending you out into it. Just as God sent me into the world, I'm going to send you into the world to heal it, to transform it, to be reconcilers, to witness, to preach, to be change agents. So I think we have to participate. And I say all that because politics is one arena where I think our voice is needed. I think our work is needed. I think the love of God to which we are called to testify is much needed in that. And if we all pull out, if we all disengage because we don't want to get our hands dirty, I think it gets worse, not better. And it's never going to be perfect this side of heaven. Things are never going to work out exactly how we want. It is going to be messy. I remember a quote from Tony Campolo, I think. He said something like, mixing faith and politics is like mixing ice cream and cow manure. It doesn't do much to the manure, but it really messes up the ice cream. And a lot of people see that, if we mix our faith up in politics, the politics aren't going to change. It's just going to mess our faith up. But I think that we have to believe what Jesus says here, that when we engage, it matters. So the first thing I just want to say to people listening is, I hope you engage. I get it, that faith is about ideals and values and truth, but politics it's about compromise and pragmatism and sometimes the best choice among a set of imperfect choices. But it's not unchristian to participate, even though we never get everything that we want when we engage in politics. So I hope you engage. But let me move on to kind of a second question I get a lot. And the question really isn't like, Matt, who should I vote for or something, but more like, how do the teachings of Jesus, or how should the teachings of Jesus impact how I vote or how I understand politics? And I want to say a word here, because I think this is really important, about how you form your political identity. I want you to think for a moment about where you got your political identity. If you identify as a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, whatever it is, where did that come from? I want you to think about that for just a second. I read a study. The study now is like 15 years old, but it still bears out. It was in 2005 that 75% of young people form their political identity from their parents. They just take whatever their parents believed, they adopt and believe. And oftentimes, especially in families that talk about politics every once in a while, they carry that into adulthood. And so family of origin is the primary, maybe the most important factor in how most of us have arrived at our political identity. But then you add to that a bunch of other factors. I mean, there's things like race and gender and economic status and education and geography, or where you grew up. All of these things kind of go into a bucket and you stir them around, and these strongly shape whatever it is that you believe. Now, I know most of us like to think that we're independent thinkers. We came at this and we just thought about it, and this is what we arrived at. But almost all of us are primarily shaped by where we grew up, what our family was like, how we were educated, what our race is, what our gender is, what our economic status is. And I'm sharing all that because what that means is that we are shaped politically from a really early age. Oftentimes, our political opinions or identity is shaped even before, in some cases, our faith is. And the problem with this is when we come to faith, especially as an adult, or when faith begins to become a bigger part of our life, usually that happens long after our politics has kind of already been decided. And this really leads to, I think, dangerous situation for Christians. What it means is that oftentimes for Christians, our faith sort of trails our politics. In other words, our political beliefs are already here, and we go out in search of a faith that sort of supports what we already believe instead of the other way around. Oftentimes, we don't take we don't make the effort to rethink our politics in light of our faith. We as human beings have a tough time changing our mind about things, especially when it comes to something as deep-seated as our political identity. And so usually what we do is we end up finding a church or a faith or kind of a way of understanding religion that actually backs up our politics, instead of having a political viewpoint or a political identity that's shaped by our faith. And I really think that we just have to recognize and own this, that for most of us, we don't just hold political opinions, but we have these deep-seated political identity. And that Scripture really calls us, our faith really calls us to always make sure that all the things that go into our identity, including politics, always have to come under our faith, never over it. So like the earliest Christian confession, for example, is the confession, Jesus is Lord, which, by the way, was a political statement because in Jesus' day, Caesar was called Lord. So when Christians would say, in fact, Caesar often made people say this confession that Caesar is Lord. And what Christians would say is, well, actually, Jesus is Lord. That became their confession, which was a political statement. And what it meant is that Jesus is first, and that everything else in my life has to fit under that. If anything ever contradicts what I think Christ calls me to, then I have to pick Christ over nationality, over whatever my gender group thinks I ought to do, my racial group thinks I ought to do, whatever my economic status tells me, whatever my political party tells me to do, that Jesus always comes first. And so I think that's important, that what I always encourage Christians to do is make sure that you're always thinking and rethinking your political viewpoints in light of what you know about who Jesus is and who Jesus is calling you to be. Don't make the error, I think, of going out in search of a version of Jesus that just fits into what you already believe. All right, but what about this question about kind of, how should I vote, or how would Jesus understand, the political choices that we have in front of us? I'll say a couple things about this. I think that, first of all, I think we have to recognize that faith and politics are not the same. I know it sounds kind of obvious, but faith and politics are not the same. And this is a mistake that I think especially Christians in the U.S. make all the time, that there really is a difference between our religious convictions and our political policies. These aren't the same thing. And I see this, by the way, on both sides of the aisle. In the Republican Party, this is most notable, I think, with what's known as like the Christian right now, which this was a movement, by the way, started in the late 70s. And in the late 70s, the religious right, as they called themselves, kind of in an effort to take back the moral fiber of our country, they began to conflate their religious convictions with their political policy making or their political convictions. And they decided, we want to take what we believe religiously and we want to make that the law of the land. We want to impose it on other people. And when this happens, all of a sudden politics no longer became this arena where people with different opinions came together to compromise and to find solutions that worked. This became the place where we had to fight to make sure that what we believed was accepted by everyone else. And this is about the era, I really think, when compromise started going out the window, because all of a sudden, political convictions became religious convictions, and we cannot compromise, right, on our religious convictions. And so you began this trend of political viewpoints where there was no room for compromise. I think anything that too closely marries, our beliefs and our political activity is dangerous, because faith and politics isn't the same. Having said that, I would say that I think our faith has to inform our politics. You can never keep these things separate. And I have people all the time tell me, Matt, I just like to keep faith out of politics. Or I don't think faith should come up, or politics should come up in church. Or I don't think faith is political. And I would just say respectfully that that's an uneducated understanding of faith. Faith from the very beginning, Jesus from the very beginning, there's always a political dimension to this. I don't mean a partisan dimension, but so much of what Jesus says and does is political in that it impacts not just what we believe and our connection with God, but how we ought to orient ourselves towards other people and the world. I mean, if you asked a person who truly believes that life starts at conception, for example, if you ask that person to set aside that belief when they go into the political realm, it's going to be an impossible ask for them to do. Let's take the other side of the aisle. If you ask somebody who truly believes that their faith in Jesus means a preferential treatment for the poor, that they are there to serve the poor, it's impossible to ask that person to not have that belief impact their political activity. And so faith has to inform our politics. But we have to be careful not to think that our faith necessarily leads to any sort of political solutions. And so I'll talk about the left for a second. I kind of talked about how I think the right got it wrong in the late 70s. I think oftentimes we see this on the left, that religious people on the left will take things out of Scripture like, yes, we're to care for the poor. Yes, we're to care for immigrants. Yes, we are to heal the sick. And they immediately will translate those into sort of specific policies. And the truth is that I think Christians of good faith can disagree on the solutions, on the policies, but what we can't disagree on really is that we're called to serve the poor. We're called to serve the immigrant. We're called to heal the sick. So faith has to influence politics. But I'll just end this section this way. So what would Jesus say? I was talking to a friend today, and this question that like every political campaign asks, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Have you ever heard that? Ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Do you want to vote for the guy who's been there or some new guy? I don't exactly know how Jesus would vote in a democracy. Jesus didn't live in a democracy. But I think I can say with confidence that is not the question Jesus would ask. The question Jesus would ask is not, am I better off than I was 4 years ago? I mean, basically, that question is, what would be best for me? What would be best for me? And if we know anything about Jesus, Jesus would never encourage us to think more about ourselves and to vote only in a way that best benefits us, that provides us the most money or the most benefit or the easiest way to get ahead. I mean, that's not what Jesus would encourage us to do. What kinds of questions would Jesus ask if it's not, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I don't know, I wrote down a few. What's best for the poor? I think that's a question that Jesus would be very likely to ask. I don't just mean poor economically, but the vulnerable, those on the margins, those who have been shoved aside or ignored, those who don't have power as the world defines it. I think Jesus would ask what's best for them. I think Jesus might ask some version of a question of what would allow for the most people to thrive and to be cared for, what's best for the common good and not just for me. Jesus might ask, I almost certainly think would ask, what's the most loving thing I can do in this situation, not just for myself, but for my neighbor, for those around me. And so I really think it's important that we remember that we don't turn our faith off when we go to the ballot box, that we can't enter into an election and say, well, in this realm, I'm just going to do what's best for me and what's best for my money, what's best for my family, what's best for my neighborhood. I mean, in that realm, just like any other realm of our life, Jesus asks us to put the common good ahead of our own good, to think about others at least as much as we think about ourselves, and to at least make our choice with the deep belief that it is what is best for those who are on the margins, those who are vulnerable, those who are on the edge. All right, I'm going to end with maybe the most difficult question that I get asked, and that is, Matt, okay, I get, faith, politics, fine. I know who I'm going to vote for. I think I know what I believe there. What I don't know how to do is, how do I deal with people who don't think the same way that I do? Because right now they are driving me crazy, and I really get that. And I'll offer just a few reflections as we kind of close with that question. There is a block button, by the way, on Facebook. I don't know if y'all know this. Like, you can snooze somebody. Is that what it's called? Set them on snooze for 30 days. Like, I don't want to listen to you for a week. If you don't want to block them altogether, you can do that. I don't know why more of you, by the way, don't just do that. But let me talk a little bit about how to approach those that don't think the same way as me. I want you to remember a few things that Jesus said. Really quick hits. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, love your enemy. Jesus said, love one another because God is love. Jesus said, they'll know that you follow me by the way that you love one another. I mean, over and over and over again. If you read Scripture even superficially, you'll find out that Jesus' first and last commandment to us is to love other people. That's it. And so what we have to figure out is, how do I best love this person who right now I really want to hate or I really find difficult? And I'm just going to give you a few things that have helped me. Maybe they'll help you. One thing I do is I try to avoid caricaturing people. Do you know what I mean? Like, I try to avoid stereotyping people. Like, the Republican, if you vote that way, they're just dumb, stupid, racists. Or if you vote Democrat, they're elite, they're liberal, snowflakes. I find people do this all the time, and at least with my interactions, I find that people are much more complicated and make decisions based on a whole complicated set of factors. It's rarely about one thing. Rarely are they thinking about you, even though I wish they'd think about others more. Often our decisions, especially in politics, are not rational, but more emotional. Oftentimes they're because of things that are happening in our lives that we're taking out on other people. And almost always, if you would take time to really get to know somebody who's spouting off on Facebook or somebody that you see on social media, almost always you would find that they're a more complicated character than the 140, letter tweet allows them to be. And so I think one of my just first admonitions to you is to just really try to avoid stereotyping all people who do X, Y, or Z. Second thing that I try to do is, and this kind of leads from that, is I try to always choose personal relationship and conversation over social media engagement or broad stereotyping. So rather than dealing with all the people who do this or think this way or vote for this person, I try to deal with actual real people in my life. And almost always I find that real in-person conversation leads to a much better outcome with people that I disagree with than engagement on social media. Now, I know right now we're in coronavirus and stuff, but what I mean is if you're really struggling with a person, talk to that person on the phone, talk to them directly, chatting, get together with them in person when it's safe or if it's safe to do that. And I'll invite you to think about this. If it's a person that you don't care enough about to have a personal conversation with them, then don't have a social media conversation with them. If they're not that important to you, then don't get into it with them on social media. If they're important enough to you, have a real conversation with just them. I did this, by the way. I practiced this. A person in my life whose Facebook posts were driving me nuts. Not only that, they were making me really mad, and I don't get mad that easily. And I found myself wanting to blast him on social media, but I decided to pull him offline and have a direct conversation. It was over chat, and we did this. And it was heated and it was hard, but after talking for a little bit, we began to see each other's perspective just a little bit more. He actually changed in ways that surprised me. I actually grew to have a different understanding of where he was coming from, and it was much healthier. I think that all of us would do well to think about that. If you don't care enough about this person's perspective to talk to him one-on-one, don't care enough to get into it with them on social media. Third thing, I think that when you do talk to people, especially people that really frustrate you, family member at Thanksgiving or whatever it is, listen and ask questions more than you argue. Now, I know this is easier said than done, but I try to go into situations where I know I'm going to disagree with a person. And off the bat, I just decide, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to keep asking questions in an effort to understand. Now, don't ask cynical questions, Like, how did you get to be so stupid? Or, why are your beliefs so uninformed? Don't do things like that. That's passive-aggressive questions. But really, ask questions. Tell me more about that. How did you arrive at that? I think really differently about it, but how did you arrive at that decision? Ask the person, how do you deal with people who see it differently? What is it that you think about my perspective? And you'd actually be amazed. Those simple questions can open up more common ground between you and this person that you think you have nothing in common with. Much more common ground than you initially think. So listen and ask questions instead of arguing. I kind of said the next one, find common ground with the people. Instead of going right at what you disagree about, find elements like, okay, I can agree with you on that and build from there. I often do this with people that I deeply disagree with. Like, rather than hopping right to the thing that we know we're divided about, let's go back to some things that we know we share. And then let's go the next step and the next step and the next step. And often there you realize that, yeah, we disagree here, but now we've established that, hey, there's like 4 out of 5 of these things that we actually do agree on. That often helps to unite people rather than divide them. And then the last 2 things I think are really more about our internal life. I hope that you approach other people with like a humility and a teachability. And a question I often ask myself is, I wonder what wrong political opinion I hold today. Now, I'll ask you that question. What wrong political opinion do you hold? Of course, it's a hard question to answer, because if it was wrong, we'd change our mind. And yet we know that we probably aren't perfect, that every single one of our judgments maybe haven't been perfectly thought out. So maintain a level of humility that maybe I have something to learn. Maybe I haven't thought this through, or I haven't thought about it from another person's perspective. And the second kind of internal work is, I'd just be really careful about the kind of power you give other people over how you feel and over your life. I would ask, why do you allow certain people to continue to get to you? And this really goes back to the beginning. You're not bound to continue to engage people that are deeply hurtful to you. You don't have to try to change the mind of people who are really offensive to you. You don't have to keep around on social media people who continue to speak not just opinions you disagree with, but things that go right to the heart of like who you are. That drawing boundaries sometimes is an act of love, where we say, I can't engage you this way. I'm going to have to, draw a boundary and redefine the kind of relationship we have. That's an okay and healthy thing to do. You don't have to continue to subject yourself to opinions or speech or things that cut right to the heart of who you are. All right, I'm going to close by saying this. I'm pretty sure that whatever happens on Tuesday, November the 3rd, on Wednesday, November the 4th, when we wake up, or Thursday or Friday, or whenever we know the results of the elections, there will be, some percentage of the people that are upset that it didn't go their way. And if it doesn't go your way, I want you to remember that we have been here before. Jesus is the same, Scripture says, yesterday, today, and forever. That our call as Christians is exactly the same, to love one another, that Jesus cares more about who we are and how we carry ourselves than what policies we support. And I think most of all that we have work to do, whether the world is looking more like we think it should look or whether we think it's moving further away from what we think it should look like. Christians oftentimes have done their best work in the middle of persecution or in the middle of a political environment that values what we think are all the wrong things. That oftentimes those are the scenarios in which people need the love and the witness of you as a Christ follower, us as a church, that they need us in those environments sometimes more than ever. And then finally, I'm just mindful of something that Jesus said to his disciples. You know, when there were just like 12 or so of these guys, there was not much reason to believe that this movement was going to become powerful. And Jesus said to Peter, actually, you know, Peter, I'm going to change your name from Simon to Peter. And on this rock, because that's what Peter meant, it meant rock. He said, on this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. In other words, the church and Christ's witness in the world has persevered through some of the worst political systems, the worst rulers, the most evil policies of the past. And I really do think Jesus, the love of God, and the witness of the church, which includes us, will prevail no matter what happens on the other side of an election in 2020. So I'll leave you with this. We are a Methodist church. That's the kind of church I pastor. And John Wesley was asked a similar question in October of 1774. He wrote in his journal that he gave advice to those people who were Methodists who wondered how they should vote in the ensuing election, what his advice was. His advice was a lot shorter than mine. He said 3 things. He said, vote without fee or reward for the person you judge most worthy. Pretty good advice. No one's, by the way, ever paid me directly to vote for them. Number 2, to speak no evil of the person they voted against. A lot of you have already broken that rule, by the way, but you can start now thinking about that. And number 3, to take care of their spirits, that they aren't sharpened against those that voted on the other side. Do not let elections and the fact that we have to make a choice sharpen us against other people. But I think we have to work extra hard as Christians to remember God's call to look beyond red or blue or rural urban or whatever divides us, and to think, how can I best love this other person? Because the truth is, whether you define them as a friend or an enemy, whether they are someone you think is good or someone that you think is bad, whether they're someone who's far away or someone right next door to you, what God wants us to do is exactly the same, and that is to love. So I'll end there. I thank all of you for joining me. I pray, and I ask you to pray for our national leaders, our local leaders, state leaders, all those who will be voting. And until next time, thank you all so much for tuning in.